Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, businesses and schools across Ivory Coast are shut on Monday amidst an ongoing mutiny. The government says it struck a deal. Some mutineers, though, don't seem impressed. Also, in South Africa, hundreds of protesters gather outside of the country's top court as opposition parties argue for the right to hold another motion of no confidence against President Jacob Zuma, but this time by secret ballot. And in Burkina Faso, the trial in absentia of former President Blaise Compaoré and his cabinet is suspended. It's a worrying development for those hoping that he'll be held to account for a fatal crackdown on protesters in 2014. But first, some renegade soldiers in Ivory Coast have already rejected a proposed deal from the government to end an ongoing mutiny. Businesses and schools across the country were shut on Monday, and armed troops who say that their owed money took over strategic parts of cities, including Yamoussoukro and Abidjan. At least one person's been killed in the 4-day-old protests. On Monday evening, the Ministry of Defence announced that a deal had been struck, but the stalemate may yet continue. Earlier, I spoke to Sean Lingas in Abidjan.
I have not been responded to by the government spokesman nor a source of the Ministry of Defense asking for more details. It's unclear if the government plans to divulge any details this evening. The Minister of Defense went on national television just a short time ago in a declaration that was barely a minute long, saying, "We've reached a deal. Soldiers, go back to your barracks and bring peace back to the country," without giving any details about that accord. And I can tell you that the lack of information disseminated by the government upset many Ivorians, given how anxious the day has been here. But the government says, it said this before on other occasions during the January mutiny, where we have a deal, everything's okay, but the implementation of the deal is what trips up the return of calm and order. So time will tell whether this deal holds. We're already hearing that some of the mutineers are rejecting the deal. That's yet to be confirmed, but there have been reports of gunfire in Abidjan since the so-called accord was announced. It's impossible at the moment to say whether that's celebratory gunfire or antagonistic gunfire. So the situation is still very much up in the air, and the next few hours will be very important.
Sean Lingas there for us in Abidjan. Now, many of the Ivorian army mutineers helped President Alassane Ouattara take office back in 2011. The pay dispute with the government began earlier this year. Clément Bonero has the details.
These are the men behind the army mutiny in Ivory Coast. Former rebels who controlled much of the country's north throughout the 2000s and backed President Alassane Ouattara during the post-electoral violence of 2011. They now make up about 8,400 of Ivory Coast's 22,000-strong army, but have never been fully integrated. Clashes first erupted in January when the former rebels claimed they were due back pay and bonuses for their support of Ouattara. A deal was reached after 2 days of violent protests.
I confirm my agreement to take into account the demands relative to the bonuses and the better living and working conditions of the soldiers. I call on all the soldiers to go back to their barracks in order to allow for these decisions to be implemented peacefully.
The government promised to pay the rebels bonuses of 12 million CFA francs, around 18,000 euros each. So far, they've received 5 million francs, not the remaining 7 million, which had been due by the end of May. The government says it's strapped for cash because of plummeting revenue from cocoa, its main export crop. Rebels, meanwhile, are divided. A spokesman for the group said last week they'd dropped demands for the remaining money, a claim rejected by other soldiers, sparking fresh clashes on Friday.
In Johannesburg, hundreds of protesters gathered outside of the South African top court as it heard arguments from opposition parties who are hoping for the green light to hold a motion of no confidence against President Jacob Zuma by secret ballot. The ANC said that rules won't allow it and has rejected calls for private voting. Criticism of Zuma is ramped up in the wake of a spate of scandals and concerns that the country's economy is being hurt by his leadership. Ashton Lang was in court on Monday. She tells us more about the court's role in this latest bid to challenge Zuma.
This is the highest court in the country, so whatever it decides, Parliament must abide by. However, it's very unclear what the court will decide. The Speaker of Parliament has said she has no discretion to order a secret ballot. What opposition parties are arguing in court is that she is either required to allow a secret ballot or she's permitted to, but not, as the President suggested, is she prohibited from ordering a secret ballot. What opposition parties say is that the South African people want to know if the President enjoys the support of the majority of Parliament, and the only way to find that out for sure is to allow them to vote in secret. If they are not allowed to vote in secret, they suffer intimidation potentially, and they say they could potentially be removed by the ANC from their positions. What Jacob Zuma says is there's no evidence that they have been intimidated in any way, and opposition parties are really trying to protect MPs' jobs rather than acting under the Constitution. It seems pretty unlikely that the court will order Parliament to allow a secret ballot. There has been criticism that there's judicial overreach by supporters of Jacob Zuma following a series of judgments against him. However, it is entirely possible they will remind the Speaker of her constitutional obligation to allow a secret ballot. The ball then back in her court. Remember, she's the Speaker of the ANC, very difficult one for her to call.
Ashton Lang there for us. Now, after 3 days of clashes in the Central African city of Bangassou, armed Christian militia on Monday released about 1,000 people who'd been being held hostage in a mosque there. Women, children and those injured in the violence were set free first before the remaining men were evacuated. UN peacekeeping forces later exchanged fire with fighters at the site. Over 24 people are believed to have been killed in the weekend standoff. Zambian opposition leader Hakainde Hichilema has been acquitted of insulting police officers, but will be held in custody for at least another week. On Monday, a magistrate in his treason case delayed his ruling on whether Hichilema could face trial until May 22nd. The politician was arrested last month for allegedly obstructing President Edgar Lungu's official limousine as the two men travelled through Zambia's western province. His lawyers say the charges are baseless. Ugandan opposition leader Kizza Besigye has been arrested again. He was detained by police at the border of Isingiro and Tungamu on Monday as he made his way to a political rally. Besigye's been arrested multiple times and faces allegations of treason, which he says is further persecution from the government of President Yoweri Museveni. To Burkina Faso now, where the trial of former President Blaise Compaoré was suspended on Monday. He's being tried in absentia after having fled the country during a popular revolt back in 2014. That was after almost 3 decades in power. Victims of his regime are threatening to return to the streets in protest if the trial is discontinued. Our correspondents report.
As the president of the Family of Martyrs Association, Victor visits some of those who lost relatives during the crackdown on the anti-government protests of 2014. For 3 years now, these families have lobbied for justice. Since the end of April, former President Blaise Compaoré and his government have been on trial at the High Court, but 3 weeks in, and morale is low amongst many of those hoping the case will help them come to terms with their loss.
It's very important for us to play our role, to comfort and to visit victims' families. Because once they heard all these announcements of postponements, they were alarmed.
Survivors of the unrest also share their distress with Victor. Many still feel deeply angry about Compaoré's regime. This woman's wounds still haven't healed, and bullet wounds have deformed Jean's legs forever. Nevertheless, he says he's ready to return to the streets in protest if the trial is discontinued.
We're very concerned. We don't know how it will end. If it doesn't end well, we'll have even more courage than we had on October the 30th and the 31st in 2014, and we'll go out again for a bigger insurrection than before.
The victims of the uprising are already preparing for the worst. If the trial is dropped, they've already made banners emblazoned with slogans aimed at the High Court and featuring the faces of some of those killed during Blaise Compaoré's 27 years in power.
And finally, we end on a high note. Femi Kuti can blow his own trumpet now after having successfully bagged the title of the person who's played the longest ever single note on a saxophone. Having narrowly missed out on the world record last week, the Nigerian musician held the note for more than 51 minutes. The secret is a circular breathing method, which unfortunately the Guinness Book of Records doesn't recognise. However, it won't be certifying his achievement, but he has certainly left his fans breathless. So congratulations, Femi Kuti. That is, though, where we'll have to leave it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks very much for joining us, and do so again if you can. Take care.